Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're kind of getting towards the end, moseying on to the end of our book here of Faith Has Its Reasons. We're in the middle of chapter 21, Contending for the Faith, Apologetics, and Human Knowledge. And what our authors are doing is they're presenting their case of how these four different approaches can kind of be broadened out and take into incorporation different aspects of the other approaches. So they kind of want to make a case that their case isn't a single case, but it's taking these four cases and saying, can we learn from the other approaches and what else can we bring into it? So in our last episode, we looked at kind of one aspect, but also how the other ones can be broadened out by the other three. And so now we're going to test it out and see what that looks like. And so the first one that they test out is against postmodernism. So the authors kick off here by saying the utility of the integrative approach may be illustrated by considering how Christian apologists should respond to the challenge of postmodernism. It turns out that all four approaches make a valuable point on this. The classical apologist correctly observes that postmodernism is self-refuting, and the evidentialist makes another good point. Postmodernism is unrealistic, and it doesn't fit with the facts, and especially when it is in the field, it's really hard to take your postmodernist approach to that and say, is this a dinosaur skeleton, or is this? We're unable to know until we discover it, but we need the proper a background in order to know a thing like a bone and be able to hold it.
Yeah. Is there absolute truth? Is it objective? Or it isn't, right? Well, that's a claim. That's a self-refuting claim, says the classical apologist, right? You can't say there is no truth, right? And then is that true, right? Kind of thing, right? Or there's, and the evidentialists, right, as they say, it really, so if there's no objective truth, then why do you look both ways before you cross the street? I mean, so yeah, there's issues there. And then they look at, with regard to Reformed apologetics and postmodernism. So the Reformed apologists can make some very helpful points that tell us the new Reformed epistemologists may say in response to the charge of modernism, right, that the belief in objective truth is not the particular notion of modernism, but is a properly basic belief, right? So we all believe that, they say the person who believes in objective reality and objective truth can no more stop believing in them, right? Objective reality and truth, then he can't stop believing that he had, say, orange juice for breakfast, right? And so there's kind of a Reformed epistemologist approach to postmodernism.
Mm-hmm. Right. All right. Well, let's look at apologetics and theology. Well,
right. So in this section and the next several sections now, they look at theology, philosophy, and these various kind of areas and how now you can integrate apologetics, how the integration approach works with regard to these various areas is what they're considering here.
Right. And so the first one is apologetics and theology. To some extent, the differences among the four approaches to apologetics reflects differing theological roots. Generally, classical apologetics has been most dominant in Catholic theology and among apologists influenced by Catholicism, including Anglicans of a more Catholic bent, of course. This is what one would expect, given the formative contributions to the classical model by Thomas Aquinas. Of course, we got to talk about Thomas Aquinas. Thus, some of the leading classical apologists have been the Anglican writers of C.S. Lewis, who starts out mere Christianity by almost begrudgingly being Anglican, and then also the Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft and Norman Geisler. All those people we've talked about throughout the history of this book as well, in the history of the classical era. And all those gentlemen who studied philosophy at Loyola University as well.
Right. So Geisler wasn't obviously a Catholic, but he did study at a Catholic university, right? Go figure.
Right. And
Loyola.
That's one of his a critique against him, and a lot of his students surrounded themselves with Aquinas and Catholics and swam the Tiber River that way. Well, of course, classical apologists has been widely influential among Christians of most theological traditions and denominations. In fact, one could probably say, other than maybe the last few years, it's been the dominant, or maybe even so much the only one kind of considered.
Right. So notice they're making the claim here that it didn't just stay with Catholics, right? It broadened out to other theological traditions and denominations as well.
So they're saying, just keep going. Just keep feeling the ripple effect. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah. All right. So what about evidentialists? Well, they tell us that evidentialists tend to be evangelicals who are non-Calvinist or Arminian in their theology. Remember, we're looking at apologetics and theology, right?
Right.
And so classicalists tend to lean toward Catholic ideas, right? Not always. And we know that the classicalist approach is broadened more than just to the Catholicism. The evidentialists, they say, are evangelicals who are non-Calvinist or Arminian in their theology, right? And so they lean toward being Arminian. Again, they're looking at the general perspective, not each individual person who does apologetics in this kind of way. The Reformed apologists, as the name implies, tends to be staunchly, even perhaps dogmatically, they tell us, Reformed or Calvinist in their theology. And so while not all Calvinists, espouse Reformed apologetics, for instance, R.C. Sproul was a classical apologist.
Mr. Reformed himself.
Yeah, that's right. But most, if not all, Reformed apologists are Calvinists or have deep Calvinist theological roots, right? So there's kind of the perspective, theological perspective for that apologetic methodology. And then they tell us that we've traced the roots of, fideism to Martin Luther. And again, not all Lutherans are fideists, right? Montgomery is a Lutheran, and he's the paradigm evidentialist, right? So not all Lutherans are fideists, but most, if not all, modern fideists have roots in the Lutheran theological tradition. So that's, so they've given us a perspective in terms of apologetics and theology.
Right. So it doesn't follow that once you've picked your camp that you're going to be in there. And so why is that? Because they're suggesting that different areas or avenues of theology or denominationalism has seen value in those other areas and brought them into consideration within their theological perspectives. Well, that brings us to the relationship between theology and apologetics. The classical apologist tends to view apologetics as prolegomena, establishing the foundations of theology. The evidentialists as polemics, defending debated aspects of theology, and Reformed apologists as part of theology, and the fideists as persuasive theology. So those are the four kind of avenues that those different types of apologists tend to take when it comes to apologetics and theology. And so the authors say then, we suggest that there is truth in all of these views. And of course, that seems to be the case of what they're unpacking here because of how they're identifying them. Yeah,
good. All right, so that's apologetics and theology. What about apologetics and philosophy, right? And so they tell us that the different views of philosophy characteristic of the four major approaches are, to some extent, a reflection of the fact that the meaning and scope of philosophy has changed over the centuries. Many 20th century philosophers, for instance, prefer to understand philosophy as a method of analysis and critique, and not as kind of the older approach where it was a systematic view of reality. And so the problem here, they say, with these four approaches to philosophy is that they all assume an all or nothing point of view, right? Some ideas in non-Christian philosophy happen to be true, and here the classic approach can proceed on safe ground. But other ideas here are, of course, wrong, and Reform apologists and fideists are right to criticize them. So some methods of reasoning may be useful and reliable, and other methods may not be. And so that what they're suggesting here is you don't need to take an all or nothing approach with regard to apologetics and philosophy.
Right. Right. Well, how about Christianity and science? Well, various philosophers of science have observed that there are four basic models of relationships between science and religion, or science and theology. Ian Barber describes them as conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. And I'll just again point to Zondervan's Counterpoint series, because they do have a book that focuses on this type of distinction between them among the authors.
Yeah, yeah. Oftentimes you see this whole idea of Christianity and science as a conflict, right? This is probably the most popular view of it, right? They're fighting with each other.
Right.
But what Barber suggests is that you can also have a position that says they're independent from each other. That science looks at the world, the empirical world, and that sort of thing, and Christianity, or religion is what he calls it, looks at, spiritual or things, or perhaps values, right? So you get this dichotomy of fact value. Science deals with facts and religion deals with values. So they're independent of one another, right? Mm-hmm. Now, we don't necessarily buy that, but that's how he describes this independence view. Mm-hmm. The dialogue view basically is that they can talk with each other, that they're dealing with, various aspects of the world, but they can still communicate with each other. And of course, the integration view says that you can put them both together, that they're giving us a picture of the whole world. And so they both can be integrated, right? And so he gives us kind of four perspectives on how Christianity and science, might be related to one another. And so what our authors here tell us is that the all or nothing assumption characteristic in the debate over philosophy and apologetics is also evidence within science as well. Almost all of the apparent conflicts between science and theology are really between what some scientists and some theologians say. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not science isn't conflicting with theology, but some scientists are conflicting with some theologians and vice versa. And so what they tell us is that this means that some scientific theories really do conflict with Christian teachings. So that it's not all that they're all non-conflicting. There are some conflicts, mm-hmm. and they tell us the fetus is right to suggest that some scientific theories deal with questions of a different type than theology. But this way of handling apparent conflicts goes only so far. Where there is a real possibility of conflict, they tell us, there's also a real possibility of agreement and therefore of confirmation. Mm-hmm. And so this all or nothing assumption, you don't have to, go with that approach, right? There's truth in science, obviously, and so you don't have to throw it out.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's where kind of presupposition says you can use science as long as you can justify it. Even those who aren't able to justify it can actually use it because of the origin of where science stems itself from. But then if you look at something like the solid state of the universe that was popular before Big Bang moved it out, that would definitely conflict with Genesis 1 in any detail. And so if you had someone who's a stickler for science that says, oh, science has proven that it's only a solid state because of all these things. Well, then once the paradigm have shifted and the revolution occurred, and now we have the new paradigm of the Big Bang Theory, now there's less contention there. And so, I think this book has talked about, we talked about it with Mitch Stokes' How to Be an Atheist, which is an excellent book. We sometimes should take a step back and say it's not what science says, but it's what scientists say. And a lot of times, if you wait 20, 30, 50 years, all those scientists will have been revolted against and now have to learn about things like 333 degrees of dimensions. So all that's there. All right. Well, then moving on then to revelation and history. So again, all these things should kind of sound familiar of looking at the different aspects with the meta-apologetics of the different apologetic approaches. And here, our authors are doing pretty much the same thing by saying, how can all these be integrated together? So with revelation and history, one of the clearest areas of disagreements among the four approaches is their view of history. The classical apologist argues that a right view of history requires the right worldview, namely theism. The evidentialist contends that it requires the right method, namely an empirical method that makes minimal assumptions about what is historically possible. The Reformed apologist contends that it requires the right revelation, namely God's word in Scripture, and the fetus rejects the whole idea of faith being based on historical knowledge. So clearly the distinctive approaches. So how can we find any disagreement, or how can we find any agreement here to integrate?
Right, exactly. And so what they tell us then is the perspectival view of historical knowledge is in relation to faith can surely see some validity, obviously, in all four approaches. The miracle claims of the Bible ultimately make no sense unless the God of the Bible exists, right? So that's kind of the classicalist kind of deal, right? So in this respect, both the classicalists and the Reformed apologists are right. But it does not follow that a person must first accept a theistic worldview or the Bible, they tell us, as God's revelation to recognize the evidence for biblical miracles as being persuasive. So the evidentialists can do their work there. And they say that some people are actually persuaded to believe in the God of the Bible on the basis of the historical evidence for the biblical miracles, especially the resurrection. So again, there's the evidentialist approach can have their way in this particular area as well.
Yeah. And I doubt there's going to be a Reformed apologist who is going to stop somebody from believing because, their recognition of the possibility of miracles or the resurrection happening is done outside of their worldview. There's no like, whoa, stop. First, you have to understand, who God is, and then be able to. If you come to saving faith, it's not like we're going to stand in your way. All right, well, the fetus raises a legitimate concern when he observes that belief in the historicity of a miracle is not the same as faith in the God who did the miracle. But surely this point can be not merely conceded, but wholeheartedly affirmed without abandoning arguments in support of the belief in the miracle. The crucial point here is that belief in the historicity of, say, the resurrection is a necessary but not sufficient condition for faith. A person who has faith in Jesus to save him from his sins must believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead, as Romans 10 tells us. A dead man cannot do anything for us. He is alive and intercedes for us. Mm-hmm. But of course, merely agreeing to this fact does not constitute faith. One must act on this belief by calling on Jesus for salvation. And so that's why when we're explaining things like calling on the name of or believing or even, I appreciate a good sinner's prayer as much as anyway, but we have to also understand that just saying a magic incantation is not occurring here, but that, this isn't the ability to Pascal wager yourself into the kingdom of God by praying to all the gods and saying that you're covered.
Yeah. All right. So we have we've worked our way then through philosophy and science and history. What about apologetics and experience? This is the last area that they want us to see this kind of integration approach. So they tell us, so let's begin with the heart of the fetus perspective, right? Christian apologetics can be credible only when apologists are credible Christians, says the fetus, right? And so a hypocritical apologist does more damage to the reputation of the Christian faith than do hypocrites in most other positions in the church. But credibility includes both, notice, moral and the intellectual dimensions, right? So you have to be both credibly in terms of how you live, but also there has to be some intellectual credibility as well. You just, so that needs to be taken into account, and they're suggesting that the fetus dismisses the intellectual dimensions of credibility.
Mm-hmm. This is something that I think Frame really brought out well when it talks about the being moral in our intellectual endeavors as well in the book that we covered with him, in that, we need to be honest, we need to be forthright, and then the kindness and love, obviously, that we want to show to people. We want to be Christian while giving the Christian message. Shouldn't be a shock to any of us. And so I think he spoke well for this moral and intellectual dimensions of credibility. Well, while moral failure reflects poorly on the church's message, so does intellectual failure. The classical apologist argues that the universality of the religious impulse, the universal desire for transcendence, proves that a transcendental God who can satisfy that desire exists. This argument is not undermined by the failures of Christians. If anything, such failures prove that what all people, including Christians, need is not mere religion, but God, and not just any God, but the God of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. And so that kind of ends this, this initial foray into this integrative approach, right? That they want to suggest. In other words, picking here and there from each of these various approaches and including them in a full orb kind of apologetic. So what they're going to talk about next now is, what about the various arguments? How can you integrate the various arguments from the various apologetic perspectives into some type of way that will meet the various perspectives that you meet? And so that's what they want to, the next chapter is going to deal with.
Right. And we usually do say that, we don't cover everything here. We can't, the size of the book is there. We want you to go spend your money with our authors as well to show it. But this next chapter will also have, if you're a fan of charts and organization in that perspective, they do a good job of really kind of showing the distinct approaches in its full there. So
and how they relate and interact together. Yeah. And so these charts are going to be really helpful, right? So
that's why we suggest to click all the links down below in the description or at caveofthecross.com/whatever the episode number. So if you want to go back and just go back through our episodes, EP and then the number as is usually how we end it. So caveofthecross.com/EP 202, or what have you. So you can go back to 01 if you wanted to and start from there and just keep adding 1 to it. So, yes, that's what we'll do next time is cover the next chapter. And we've got one more chapter after that. And we're almost to the end, and we'll have to figure out something else to do. If only there were maybe 1 or 2 more books left to read, but I think we're getting close to the end. So
that's right. We're gaining on the books.
That's right. We need to go to war with all publishers and just stop it, and we'll pause Amazon for a little bit, and we'll all be good. We'll all be able to catch up. All right. Well, caveofthecross.com for all your Cave of the Cross needs, and also the short clips can be found on YouTube. And so, as always, we thank you, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.